Good morning. I'm Jørgen Randers talking to you from my home office in Oslo on behalf of myself and my colleague through 30 years, Ulrik Goluke, who is in Germany. I will be talking about a project that has been underway for many years. It is our attempt to build a fully endogenous system dynamics model of a modern capitalist economy. In other words, we are trying to make an alternative macroeconomic theory, something that is simple and still insightful enough to replace the neoclassical, the static neoclassical macro theory that dominates economic discourse in the Western world and essentially also in the non-Western world. We have been struggling with this challenge for a great number of years, and what I will do today is essentially to give you a status report on the core of the current model. The main ambition in our project is to make a simple model, and it should be simple and at the same time being capable of reproducing the general trends in 20 time series for the US economy from 1980 to 2020. Time series that cover both the real and the financial economy. It has proven difficult, much more difficult than I thought. We are building on the shoulders of all those system dynamicists that have tried to do this before us. None of the earlier attempts have achieved our goal, which is to have a simple model, a model that can actually replace current views on the economy in the public debate. What I will do today is to present to you the core of our current conceptualization. It consists of 4 reference modes, 4 behavioral patterns that we have observed in the US economy and in other capitalist economies, and the 4 basic mechanisms that we currently believe explains those developments. So you will see 4 reference modes and 4 basic mechanisms. We know already that those basic mechanisms is capable of reproducing the reference mode. The next step over the years to come is to combine it all and make the model richer in incorporating a few other elements beyond what you will see now, which is the core of the classical macroeconomic model. So let me start sharing my screen. So here is the first reference mode, which I call growth. And it is seen, it's demonstrated here in the US economic activity, the GDP, which evolves at varying rates, but in an exponential manner over the time period. The next slide shows that the growth, when seen in the US workforce, is not as smooth as in the GDP. You see that the non-farm number of workers is evolving with a 10-year wave, essentially superposed on the long-term growth rate. So this is our second reference mode, namely a 10-year wave in the economic activity level. You can see this 10-year wave even more vividly in the unemployment rate, which peaks, roughly 10 years apart. The third reference mode is the 4-year capacity cycle, which you can see here in capacity utilization. I've tried to indicate, peaks in the capacity utilization with the green stars, and they are roughly 4 years apart. You also see the 10-year wave in the capacity utilization. I've indicated with stars the major bottoms in the capacity utilization. And the fourth and final reference mode that we have discovered in the long time series data for the US is what we call the financial cycle, and it is most easily seen in the US 3-month Treasury bill, in the central bank signal rate, which has obvious peaks, every 10 years or so. And we think this is a very good indicator of the financial cycle, which is independent of the growth, the 10-year wave, and the 4-year cycle. So the question is, what could be the basic mechanisms that are causing these 4 behavior modes, the 4 reference modes? Concerning the first one, long-term growth in the economy is, as we see it and as most people see it, driven by profit-driven investment. And so you have down here the investment in new capacity, which is largely determined by the available funding, which is then dominated by current profits, which come from current sales, which comes from the current output. The B are baskets of goods and services per year. And the output is, of course, a function of the installed capacity and the current workforce, and which is influenced by the addition of new capacity, which is, of course, governed in turn by the investment in new capacity. So you have the perfectly normal positive growth rate, which drives economic growth, as long as the investments in new capacity is higher than the capacity discard. You see there are other reinforcing parts of the positive loops. The more capacity you have, the higher is the optimal workforce, which increases the workforce, which increases the output, even with the same capacity. But the workforce also requires wages, which is what forms demand for consumer goods and services, while the demand for investment goods and services comes from the investment in new capacity, and together these determine sales. So you see there are 3 loops that all jointly reinforce each other to generate long-term growth in the economy. The second basic mechanism is the one that causes the 4-year wave in the economy, and that's largely the negotiation of the wage level. It is the struggle between workers on one side and owners on the other side to keep as much as possible of the output value, the value created. So the worker share of output is the result of negotiation, where the negotiation strength is higher when there is lower when there is unemployment. The unemployment is governed by the workforce relative to the potential workforce. Workforce is determined by capacity, is determined by investment, available funding, profits, but the profits are reduced by wages. So here is one negative loop that tries to keep the worker share of output at a decent level. And the other negative loop that does the same is the one that says that when workers negotiate too strongly, the optimal capital labor ratio increases so that the optimal workforce goes down. The interaction between these two balancing loops is what we think cause the fundamental 10-year wave in the economy. I then move to the third reference mode, the 4-year cycle in the economy. And here, like everyone else, we in the system dynamics community, we believe that this is caused by inventory adjustment. So the inventory at any point in time is influenced by production, which is influenced by capacity utilization, which is governed in turn by the inventory. So the point is that if inventory is too big, capacity utilization is lowered, production is lowered, and inventory goes back to normal. There is also at the economy level the price loop, but whereas this is an important loop at the sector level, at the aggregate level, it essentially determines the inflationary pressure when demand exceeds production, because what is being produced what has been produced will be consumed anyway. And then finally, there is the fourth basic mechanism, setting out short-term interest rates. This is what I think caused the decade-long financial cycle in the economy. This is the first and the core of the financial economy in our hypothesis, and it differs strongly from most other people's attempt at doing the same thing. So we start from the point of view of available funding, which is largely the profits of the incumbents, but of course supplemented with whatever external capital these investors can manage to get hold of. And the borrowing cost is of course what determines how much external capital they add to their profits in order to get the available funding. The borrowing cost is determined by the 3-month interest rate, adding the bank margin and the credit risks. And the 3-month interest rate in turn is determined by the central bank signal rate, which is the result of the signal bank trying to keep inflation at the proper level and keeping unemployment at the proper level. And of course, the inflation rate goes back to the inventory, goes back to output, goes back to capacity, and unemployment goes back to workforce and back to capacity, and this closes essentially the loop. There is an interesting kicker in the system, which is the investment in alternative assets which occur when there are no investment opportunities in new capacity. And this drives a positive destabilizing loop, investments in gold, real estate, etc., which is what typically ends the 10-year capacity financial cycle. So that's where we are. We know that the basic mechanisms do recreate the reference mode. The big question is, of course, whether the 4 reference modes that we have chosen and their basic mechanisms are the right ones. In other words, are these the simplest set that is capable of recreating history and form a useful basis for macroeconomic policy analysis? That question cannot be answered before someone else comes up with an alternative set of reference modes and their alternative conceptualization, and we welcome the competition. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your questions. So that was it. I think we can take questions now. Thank you.